All right. Good morning and welcome back to this 822203. I still haven't placed the new bias resistor because I wanted to point out some issues that are quote unquote normal for this amp that can be made better. Let me zoom in a little bit. Zoom, 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 zoom. I'm actually just lowering the tripod a bit. And I'll triple check our focus. All right. Take it out of standby. Actually, is it out of standby? Turn up the master volume. Hopefully you can hear that. It's picking up a radio station. In addition to picking up the radio station, I'm going to turn the master down to this level so we can hear the buzz, but it's not going to dominate the video. In addition to picking up the radio station, there is a buzz. And that is quite typical for this era of Marshall. And people have come to expect it. Now, there can be, let's separate these two things because they're not necessarily related, though I think there's a commonality. Number one, the ground wire on the input goes over to here to this bus wire, which is on the back of all the pots. And the presence grounds over here. Well, let me move the camera down so you can see all the pots. So the presence makes its ground to this pot, which is tied to this pot. You've got the bias ground going to the bus wire here, which goes to the back of this pot, which is the mids pot where the tone stack is grounded. And then you have going to the back of the treble pot, which is also, the pot itself is grounded. Then you have the master volume ground here. You've got the connection for two different cathodes and the input right here. And you've got the channel gain pot here. If you've seen my video on Marshalls and grounding, and I'll put a link up top for this, you'll see that this is actually a terrible way to do this. You aren't controlling your signal flow. You're actually creating ground loops and eddy currents doing this. And I want to talk to the owner about fixing this. And there are different levels of fixing this. But it can be as simple as separating the bus wire so that all the preamp stuff is grounded here with this bar, and then it's snipped off before it goes to the tone stack. And this master volume ground is then made to the mids ground, because those are both going to the should be going to the cathode of the phase inverter, which is actually at the presence pot. So from the presence pot through the tone stack and the master volume ground should be one ground point, and really the bias ground should be separated from all that. That helps. It's better if this bus wire is removed, or at least not used for grounds, as in AC signal grounds. The wire on the input going to this ground is a little bit longer than necessary. It's hard to get in there with my hand right now. Let's see if I can get it from the side. And if I were to move it, I could probably tune the radio station a little bit. Other issue being that on this era of Marshall, they have this big loop. Let me move the camera down. There's this big loop of wire here going to the high gain, from the high gain stuff to the low gain stuff. That's just a shunt, but it is problematic. You have big loops of wire every place, and the main input is not shielded. It goes from here to the board, and from here, then it has a little bit of a shield to here. And that shield is not perfect. And that all can be addressed by putting a new ground connection at the chassis, very, very physically close to the jack, reducing the length and having the V1 cathodes which are on one filter cap node, and the input going here, and then the V2 stuff going to a ground point here, and that's where this volume would be grounded. And then having one ground point, typically as close to the mid spot as I can physically get it, because the output transformer is here, for the mids, the entire tone stack, presence, and master volume, and then a ground, moving the bias ground, well, I'm not going to move the camera over that way, on the other side of the output transformer. That really helps, but that requires changing the original 1982 wiring, so you have the vintage mentality versus the amp designer mentality. And I've done this in the past, and all that buzz goes away, and that radio frequency should go away. The other issue is heater noise, potentially. Let me adjust the camera angle. All right, so here we have the red and black heater wires. And on some Marshalls, they're twisted. And on some Marshalls, they're not. And on some Marshalls, they're tightly twisted. It can be good to replace all these loose wires with twisted wires. But more importantly than that, right here, this is the grid going to this V1A. And right here, it is very physically close to this black heater wire. Sometimes if I move that grid up in the air away from that at a different angle, that helps. And that can be the same thing on the second one. And sometimes it gets worse. Let's see. That doesn't really seem to be affecting things that much on this amp. On some amps, that's dramatic. Let's see about this cathode here. I'm sorry, this grid here. Not making much of a difference there. That real short length of shielded wire, though, is microphonic as hell. And it's shielded to the plate here. On some 2203s, and this is kind of a potential thing, and I'm not saying that I like to automatically carve up and mod old Marshalls, though I find it is invariably beneficial to do so. Let me set up the camera a different spot. Very often the best fix for this heater buzz is for me to install what's called an elevated DC reference. So instead of the heater center tap of the transformer going to ground, as it does over by the phase inverter filter stage, goes to the chassis right there. Instead of having the heater's reference to ground, I install a new voltage divider, typically derived from the phase inverter or screen supply. Let me move the camera down a little bit more. And I want to get a voltage divider that gives me about 50 volts of filtered DC. And then I add an additional small filter cap just for that reference. Let's take a measurement of the half voltage on the screen supply here. The full screen supply on this amp is 455 volts. If I go down to the halfway point, 223.3. So that's 223, let's call it 225. If I were to do a 3-to-1 divider, that would get me down to just around 50 volts without doing any hardcore math. So that could be a 330K resistor and a 100K resistor. That would probably get me there. I could do it with a 47K resistor and a 50 times 150K resistor. Anyway, if I were to take a tap off this screen node right here and then go through that voltage divider to ground and put a small cap, 10 microfarad, across the bottom resistors. So if I do 47K and 150K from the 47K to ground, and then reference the heater supply to that 50 volts rather than to ground, most of this buzz would go away in conjunction with improving the grounds and getting rid of that radio station. And I would dearly love to do that because it makes for a much higher quality amp. But again, it would not be a stock vintage amp. Ooh, vintage, vintage, vintage. You know, I have this in the Vintage Marshalls playlist. It's older than many of my viewers. It is a good sounding model from a very good year. And in fact, 82 is one of the last truly great years of Marshall. So vintage means good. It doesn't mean perfect. And I would like to make this perfect. So I'm going to share this video with the owner and talk about the pros and cons and answer any questions. And maybe we do a partial thing. Maybe we do the DC reference, because I can actually attach that to these unused holes on this board, and it doesn't require any permanent modification to the amp. You know, I would do a standoff mounted here, which doesn't affect this. All the stuff I do is mounted on the terminal strip that I put here. I just lift the ground wire from the existing heater center tap. And I have a new, really groovy sounding elevated DC supply takes the buzz out, but no permanent modification. Maybe I leave this old resistor on the board, the 68K grid stopper rather, which is a little bit microphonic in this area. That's because of this shielded wire. And I might even leave this shielded wire in the amp tucked into this hole, and this green wire tucked into this hole, and then install a shielded wire from here to this point with a new 68K resistor mounted there. And I would shield to ground rather than shielding to the plate. And that would also take away a lot of the noise. To get rid of the radio station, I would probably have to redo the ground and get rid of this stupid bus wire with all its loops. Let me pause this real quick though, and I'm going to let's set this up to show you. I'm going to put it in standby, and I'm going to reflow some of these solder joints a little bit, just in case we got a not so great connection, and that'll include at the input jack. I just want to make sure we have good solid solder joints and see if that makes any difference. Okay, so it's reflowed. Let's turn the master back up. No difference. So this is not a bad connection. This is a bad design with limitations. Oh my God, he said an 82 Marshall is a bad design with limitations. Yeah, it is. Sorry, that's just the way of the world. It's why people like Jose and John Suhr got started doing this, because they weren't up to the task for a lot of pro players, or they didn't offer enough. Now, granted, this is a worst case scenario. I'm going into the high gain input, so the guitar volume is off. You have to be plugged in to get the high gain on this, otherwise it defaults to the low gain, and you won't hear these issues. And it's open on the bench. And in fairness, in some rooms, there would not be any radio station. You'd still have that buzz, but you wouldn't have the radio station. Or I could rotate this axis 90 degrees and change the station, get a different station. So in some places, that radio station would be worse. Typically on a gig, and all of a sudden you're Blues Brothers, and you're getting the police scanner through there. But the other thing is, this amp, in its actual use, has metal shielding on this side of the chassis. Let's see if that makes any difference. So I've got this chassis, this shield held in place. This is actually the metal panel that goes on the back of the amp, but that's good. Let's bring the master volume up now. It's still there. So I'm going to turn the master volume up, and we're going to listen, and then I'm going to remove this metal shielding. All right, in this case, it's not making a big difference, because what we have is we have RFI, radio frequency interference, coming on the input. We have ground loops, we have heater noise. Shielding does not fix those things. When those things are fixed, the amp will have less white noise when the shielding is in place. It won't affect the rest of this stuff. So right now, it is a good sounding, typical 1982 2203, just like most of them out there. But, if the guys who are into this era of Marshall tend to be into guys like Van Halen, guys like Steve Lukather, Steve Vai, you name that era of guitarist, early to mid 80s. This was used on tons of stuff. I got news for you. Lukather doesn't buy one of these and then use it. He had a guy like me. I think John Suhr did a lot of his work. A lot of those guys, Eddie, Steve Vai, you name the pro player, especially in the LA scene in the 80s, they had a guy like me who would take this and say, okay, it buzzes. Okay, it hums. Okay, it picks up radio stations. The stock amp is pretty good. Even without adding gain stages or increasing gain through the existing stuff, what can we do to eliminate these obvious flaws? And that's what I want to do on this, but it's going to be the owner's decision. So I'm going to put this up, let him see it, and then we'll make a judgment call. But before I do that, let's hear it with a humbucker, because last night's thing, this, I guess you'll see it today as well, was just a single coil Strat, which is not really the right driver of one of these. All right, I'm doing this with my a modern Strat with a Suhr Thornbucker in the bridge. It's 8.9K. And I've got it going into the high gain channel, of course. Got it up enough to really push the speakers, not nearly at full tilt. I'm not using the lav mic for this because it compresses it clips too easy, and you don't really get a sense of what it sounds like in the room. Now, the phone mic still won't give you the true sense of what it sounds like in the room, but it's a little bit closer. When this thing is signed off on and the work is completed, we'll do a real video. But I can hear that radio station in the background just right now, so that's fun. But anyway, here's what it's sounding like, and I don't know how this is going to record. I'm gonna start at this volume, and then I'm going to turn the master down a bit and see which one sounds better on the phone when I listen to playback. I'm going to do the same kind of stuff with the master down. The master volume in these has a weakness. As you turn it down, the output cleans up. So I'm going to go back up high, even if it clips. Now, as you can hear, the stock 2203 does not have what we would consider modern high gain. Let me go back to the lav mic for a bit. So in stock form, it does not have what we really consider high gain. That's one of the reasons that a lot of these in LA would have an added gain stage, or as you could have heard in some other videos of mine, I'll put a link up if I remember to, this gain can be increased. I will say that back in the day, you saw a lot of guys using an 82 2203. They would often be using an overdrive in front of it, sometimes with the drive down, but the output level up, just to hit it harder, even harder than humbuckers. So this was often a building block of a rig, but certainly with pedals. It's one of the reasons people love the JCM 900s when they came out, because they had more gain. Though really all Marshall did was take this and stick a tube screamer in front of it. They added LED clipping, which is not the same thing as tube gain at all. But essentially, hey, people love the sound of an overdrive pedal being run into a 2203. Let's put that in there and charge extra for it. A couple diodes and LEDs. That's not the same thing as the Jose thing where you're actually doing some very specific diode clipping. But then again, you're adding gain in other places to make up for that insertion loss. And I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole other than to say, look, I speak Marshall. I speak all decades of Marshall. I speak Fender. I speak Vox. Tubes is tubes, man. Triodes is triodes. Pentodes is pentodes. They all need the same conditions. And you got to know how all the variables interact with each other. But this is actually what a fairly healthy one sounds like. I will say, however, that having played that just now, and I can't really demonstrate this with this phone recording, there is a lack of harmonic complexity. I'm not getting the right openness. I'm not getting the right harmonic response. It's not wanting to feed back at in the right way. And I am very sure that I'm not going to set up the scope and spend 30 minutes getting set up to demonstrate this to you scientifically. I'm just going to have to say, you either trust my experience or you don't. The reason this is not sounding its best is because of all the ground loops. When you have things like that, you have eddy currents, you have 60 hertz, and it's multiples. So you have 60 hertz, 120 hertz, 240 hertz, et cetera, et cetera. That's all mixed in with everything you play. Kind of far in the background, but it's there. And 60 hertz is kind of in between a B and a B flat. So you play an E, and everything has got that little beat to it. Unless you tune your entire instrument to, what would it be? 60, 120, 240. So 480. We tune to 440. If you tune your instrument to 480, this thing might play in tune. No one's going to want to play with you, but you'll sound good by yourself. Anyway, that's a good stopping point. I'm going to put this up, share it with the owner, talk to the owner, and we'll continue to tilt this windmill.